Deep listening.
الاستماع العميق.
Deep listening.
Intensiv zuhören.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
深度聆听.
Deep listening. Impact beyond words.
People that come to Australia from different contexts don't know how to listen to Australians because we're hearing words, we're seeing smiling faces, but we don't understand what they mean. So, for example, Eastern Europeans, in my experience, are seen as negative, sometimes, not all the times, negative, pragmatic, very direct, but we think of ourselves as being realistic. So with English and with Australia, we don't quite understand the context, and that takes a long time to actually get what's being unsaid.
In this episode of Deep Listening, Impact Beyond Words, we have the opportunity to listen to Eva, a foreign language interpreter, and learn from her own experience spanning multiple cultures. Originally from Poland in Eastern Europe, her intersection with a local Australian manager who didn't understand her cultural context propelled her to create a global organisation that spans Poland, the United Kingdom, New York and Australia. She bridges complex communication problems from courtrooms to community halls. Let's listen in as Eva brings her insight into how cultures can come together to solve complex communication problems.
Deep listening.
הקשבה עמוקה.
L'écoute profonde.
Deep listening. Welcome, Eva. How many languages do you speak?
Probably about 6 or 7, but 2 of them really well. So that's Polish and English.
Great. And after Polish, what would be your third most strongest language?
Probably Russian and French on par.
And then, keep going.
Ukrainian, and little other bits and pieces. Turkish, Hindi. I understand a lot of languages, but I have only a passive knowledge.
Let's tell them the story of Eva, right back from where you were born and how you came to be where you are today.
Oh dear. So I am turning 50 this year, so it's a bit of a milestone. I was born in Poland in a small town of about 60,000 people where I went to school until I was 18. And so we're talking about communist Poland with, food shortages. It was a very restrictive place, except that we didn't know that it was. So when you don't know any better, you just put up with whatever you have. But I've always had a desire to immigrate to Australia because we have family here who came here just after the war. So when I turned 18, I went to France with my father, and in those days we couldn't get a passport as a family, so my mum and my brother stayed back, and we didn't actually see them for 4 years before coming to Australia. In France, I spent about 12 months, and then I came to Australia. And I have to say that that whole journey was just so incredibly irresponsible on my part, because we had this vision of the West as, everything's going to be okay. Once we get there, it'll be fine. And, I didn't speak a word of English when I came here. I had no money, and I was also 7 months pregnant, but that's another story, at the age of 18. So 2 months after I've arrived, my son, who's now nearly 31, was born. But the first few years were incredibly difficult, and, again, we didn't know that they were difficult, but we just had to put up with stuff and integrate. My desire was always to integrate in Australia, to the point where I tried very hard to neutralise my accent. I still sound foreign even though I've lived here for 32 years. So I've worked with a psycholinguist to try and make me sound more Australian, and gave up after about 6 months, because I think after the age of 12 or 13, you can't necessarily fix it. When I was about 21, I went back to school, to college. I got myself educated and got a job and worked for various corporations, for local government. And in 2000, I opened my own company that deals with interpreting and translating.
Okay, so Eva, let's explain how interpreting works in a foreign language to those people who aren't familiar.
Interpreters are really actors. So we act out other people's words. In other words, we never know what comes out of people's mouths before they say it, and what comes out of our mouths has to represent not just the words, but the intent and the culture and all kinds of other things. So the way that an interpreter's head works is that we hear things, we store them in a section of our brain where short-term memory is stored. We convert it into another language and we spit it out in that language, and it goes on a loop. So it's a very intense and complex process, and it can never be 100% accurate because, unlike translation, when you see the text in front of you, with interpreting, you don't know what people are going to say. Sometimes, and most of the time actually, there are emotions attached to what people say. You know, they might be saying too much for our brains to retain. So it's a very unique task, I guess, where we cannot present our opinion or we can't judge what people say. We just have to stick to acting out other people's words. It's quite a difficult and complex task, I guess. But if anybody wants to try interpreting, even if they don't speak another language, I have a little tip. And that is tonight at home, turn on the news. Sit there with your remote, turn the news on for 30 seconds, turn it off and try and repeat what the news reader has just said. In other words, to be able to repeat 30 seconds of somebody's speech is actually really quite challenging without taking notes and being 100% accurate. The other point I wanted to make is that languages are not linear. In other words, when we translate concepts, not words. Often people don't understand that and they'll say things like, oh, make sure you translate it word for word. Well, that doesn't work. So, for example, if you say paint the town red in English, or if I say to you, put the light out, I'm not saying get a brush and paint it, the town red. And I'm not saying take the light and put it outside. I'm saying, whatever the meaning is. So I have to find an equivalent in that language that means the same thing, but the words might be quite different.
Eva, help our audience. If you just say the last 30 seconds of that or any other phrase in Polish or Russian so that the audience can spend 30 seconds in your shoes.
So maybe what I'll do, I'll just repeat what you said in Polish, which was a bit less than 30 seconds, but Ewo, więc może powiedz nam, jakby to wyglądało z twojego punktu widzenia. Powiedz nam, jakbyś powiedziała o tym, o czym właśnie mówimy i jakby to wyglądało z twojego punktu widzenia. So I don't know if you heard, when I speak English, I don't speak as fast. I kind of become a different person when I speak Polish. It's really quite difficult to explain, but you won't be able to see me because it's a podcast. But if you were to see my body language, you'd see that I become more animated. I really become a different person when I speak another language. And also, of course, because I'm repeating your words just in another language. So there's a disconnect there where I'm not responsible for what you say. In other words, if you were to swear or say something that I don't agree with, I still don't have the right to change that message. My job is to be impartial to what you say and to translate it into another language accurately with no judgment.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Tiefes Zuhören.
Deep listening.
Eva, talk us through the preparation you do as an interpreter when it literally, in some situations, is ad hoc and some situations it's not. How do you prepare yourself both physically and mentally as you prepare to go into a situation where you have to solve communication problems?
Often, one of the misconceptions that people that have that are not interpreters have is that terminology is the biggest problem for interpreters, and it isn't. Firstly, because they most of them are very experienced and they're exposed to all kinds of topics, issues. That is why we have a lot of very extensive knowledge about a lot of things. So the biggest issue, I guess, is self-care and preparing yourself at an emotional level. because in the community context, you will have people dying on you, or having to interpret for someone who has to switch off a life support, or, in palliative care context or dementia context. So that can be really quite difficult. So the terminology aspect of it is something that interpreters do prepare for. But I would say that if we were to give a percentage, that would only be about 10% of what we have to do. So let's say it's a conference and a topic that we're not familiar with, then of course we need to read up on briefing notes, see the PowerPoint presentation that someone's going to present, etc.
And apart from preparing with the content, you talked about self-care and being prepared outside of the context of life and death. How do you prepare yourself? How do you get your mindset right to come into those situations?
I try and act professional at all times. So, as difficult as this context or situation can be, if I break down, and let me tell you, at times we do work in situations that are massively upsetting, then I'm not doing my job. So it's a frame of mind. I take notes during interpreting, and that helps me kind of disconnect a little bit from what happens. And it also helps people that I'm there to help communicate, talk to each other. So interpreting happens in the first person. I don't say he said, she said. Everything's I. And when I take notes, I look down, and people necessarily have to look at each other. So that helps communication in the first place. But it also helps me remove myself a little from, what's happening and what might be upsetting. So that's one technique I use. So taking just half a minute before I walk into a session, just realigning my mindset, reminding myself that I am to be impartial and professional, that everything's going to be kept confidential, and then walking in, making sure that the sitting arrangements work, and taking notes, so that first of all I can be accurate, and secondly people can talk to each other and see me as a conduit to the exchange rather than a participant, if that makes sense.
What role does breathing play in your preparation?
If I'm nervous, if I am concerned about what's about to happen, then I use breathing techniques to calm myself down. It's just something I've developed over the years, and it happens kind of without any thinking on my part. So my breathing sort of slows down, and I walk in with a hat of being a consummate professional interpreter, preparing to listen. So I read a lot, and that may be, if it's a high-level interpreting for a head of state, then you do need to come prepared and informed, and also you need to be really flexible, because, people say things that, they might give you their speech, but it's not necessarily what's going to happen on the day. And there are stories of interpreters, of course, that saved the world by not interpreting what the head of state said, which is, it can be amusing, but really there are a couple of examples where interpreters actually censored what was said. You really have to be on your toes. You have to manage people, and, things like where they sit. You have to do things like ask for breaks, which sounds strange, but people think that for some reason that you can keep going for 2 hours without a break. So you kind of have to be assertive, and you need to make people understand that they need to trust you in managing, the interpreting that's about to happen.
What drew you to your profession? You've been in your own business now for many decades and making big impact in solving communication problems and listening. What was it that you wanted to achieve through your profession?
I don't know is the answer. All of this happened kind of accidentally. So I worked for local government, where I had a run-in with my boss who, despite all my efforts of trying to integrate, has called me in one day and said, "You know what, you don't belong." These were her very words. "I don't know what I'm going to do with you. You're not a team player." And I was like, really? How come? I couldn't understand it. And I sort of, at that point, I thought, I was very hurt, but I thought, okay, I'm going to take my choice and go to my own playground and make my own story. So that was really something that I didn't quite understand. And I think it's really interesting, when we talk about listening, people that come to Australia from different contexts don't know how to listen to Australians because we're hearing words, we're seeing smiling faces, but we don't understand what they mean. So, for example, Eastern Europeans, in my experience, are seen as negative, sometimes, not all the times, negative, pragmatic, very direct, but we think of ourselves as being realistic. So with English and with Australia, we don't quite understand the context, and that takes a long time to actually get what's being unsaid. And some people just never get it. I still worry about how people perceive me because of that background that I had where, if you talk to me about anything, the first thing I see is a problem. And I want to talk about the problem, and I don't necessarily want to talk about how to solve it. Whereas in Australia, we don't even call them problems. Okay, we call them challenges here, and then we focus on solution. And that's something really valuable that I've learned here. That I need to shift my thinking and sort of read between the lines a lot about what's being said. Yeah.
What do you think Australians can learn from the Polish way of listening, or what do you think Australians can learn from the Russian way of listening?
We talk less than other people, I think. We give people room and space to say what they think. We try not to interrupt. I mean, whatever I'm saying here is pretty general. But, generally speaking, we're less wordy. We're more formal. So if we don't know people, we never, sort of on a first names basis, so that the initial contact is quite formal and it might appear a bit cold. But we'll sit back and let people talk if we don't know them. But we don't suffer fools gladly. So, we sort of give people an opportunity to prove themselves. And we sit back and listen and then want to maybe contribute. But I think it takes maybe longer to develop relationships, in a business context. So what Australians could learn is, listen more and speak less. That's, what do we say? That we have 1 mouth and 2 ears. That is helpful to just understanding the context. So perhaps, living in Australia with even more removed because we might worry, how we're going to be perceived, how we're going to be understood. I think Australians are already pretty good. I think they give people a go, which is something I really love about Australia. They give you space as well to talk and explain what you do, for example. But they're a little bit less patient and less direct, I guess. And there's a lot of smiling that we don't always understand.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
깊은 듣기.
Deep listening.
I'm curious, in your work in the community sector, do you work with children, and what does listening mean as an interpreter in that context?
Okay, so working with children is a very interesting area because most children actually do speak English. So often we work with their parents and their children are there. And their Polish or Russian or whatever language skills might not be really good because they were born in Australia. So they kind of speak a kitchen variety. And often they resent speaking Polish because they don't understand the context of they really want to belong in Australia. So the children I have interpreted for, and I can give you one example, and it was a pretty harrowing case because it was to do with child abuse in a church setting. It was really difficult because on one hand I had to act professionally and, the child was with the mother. They were being interviewed by the police. On another hand, I was just mortified by the whole situation and the fact that, I was part of that community and without wanting to be judgmental, I was just petrified of the whole thing. So the best thing I can do in that sort of a situation is just do justice to the words, to make sure that I'm interpreting really accurately. I'm listening. just give justice to the communication on the day.
How do you catch yourself in that moment to stay out of judgment? How do you notice it and how do you stay away from it?
Very early in my career, I had a situation that has taught me a lifetime lesson. So since then, I've been very conscious of not being judgmental. And this was in a tribunal situation where I was interpreting for a couple of people that looked in a certain way. So they kind of looked like uneducated peasants, for want of a better word. And the situation got very quickly out of hand. There was a lot of anger in the room, so the hearing was stopped. And I felt really quite bad for this elderly parents because I read the situation in a particular way. Anyway, we left the tribunal hearing room, and in fact, we were told to leave through a separate entrance because it was such a volatile situation. And I did see the parents driving off in a silver Mercedes from the car park. So I guess the shock value of that was, don't you ever, to myself, ever judge the situation, because you just don't know. You don't know what people are thinking. You don't know where people have come from. You don't know anything, and you don't need to know anything. All you need to know is to do a good interpreting job on the day, yeah.
How has that informed you going forward then? When you catch yourself in judgment, what's the mental tricks you play to get yourself back out of judgment? Because one of the things people struggle with in their listening is being judgmental. In fact, one of the 4 villains of listening, the shrewd listener, spends a lot of their time in judgment, and what it stops them from doing is actually listening to what's happening in front of them. So how do you get back in the game, so to speak, without judgment?
I have a mantra and I do a lot of self-talk. So it'll be, don't judge. These are not your words. You've got to say what these people have said. You have to act it out. It's not your problem. You're not part of this conversation other than facilitating communication. So it kind of happens in your head unconsciously, but I am very aware of it. I couldn't do this job if I was judgmental, because you do deal with all kinds of situations that you might not agree with or be aligned with. So for me, it's a mantra. It's a self-talk kind of technique where I just say, don't judge. It's not your problem. You're here to interpret.
So let's take you out of your interpreting context and put you in everyday life. And let's talk about the 4 villains of listening: the lost listener, the interrupting listener, the shrewd listener, and the dramatic listener. Which one of those frustrates you the most when somebody's listening to you?
By far the interrupting. I hate it so much when people haven't let you finish your sentence and they already know what you're going to say, or they switch off. You can see their eyes glazing over. They switch off halfway through the point you're trying to make because they already think they know what you're going to say. It's annoying. And it happens a lot to women, I think, in my experience anyway. And I think also because I give people a lot of space, when I listen to them, they mistake that for, because people want to fill up that space with chatter, whereas I'm happy to say less but better. That would be the most frustrating type of listener for me, I think.
What do you think the cost is to you and to the interrupting listener?
The cost is that I think less of them. I'm not an equal partner in that conversation. If people don't give me enough space and time to express myself, then I'm at a disadvantage.
Thinking about the 4 villains and thinking about you as a listener, which one do you think you're guilty of?
Probably shrewd listener, I think.
How does that show up in your personal situation?
I want to size people up, I guess. I want to always blend in and not ever stand out, especially if it's in a context that I don't know well, or, in a business kind of situation or networking. And I prefer for people to talk and me to listen. But it's not always active listening, I have to say. Sometimes I kind of let them talk because it's easier for me to listen than make conversation.
For those of you listening who weren't able to see it the minute Eva said she was not actively listening. Her face tightened up a bit again, and that's another nonverbal signal. So for me, what I'm looking for while I'm listening to Eva is their congruency between what's on her face and what's coming out of her mouth. And she's so congruent. She's so transparent. Everything she says aligns beautifully. And it makes listening to her such a pleasure and so easy to do. I thank you for that transparency, Eva. Let's just dance with a concept. The 125-400 rule says we speak at 125 words a minute, and we can listen at between 400 and 900, and some people nearly up to 1,250 words a minute. But what that means for the speaker is they're thinking about 400 to 600 words a minute, but they can only say 125 words a minute as well. What it means is the most powerful thing in listening is level 4, what's unsaid. And what's unsaid is all the ideas in your mind, 400 of them, 400 words that you're trying to get out, but you can only get out 125 to 150 if you're a really fast speaker. So, Eva, how do you explore what's unsaid with others when you're listening?
It would certainly be, the tone of voice, because you can say anything, but depending on your tone of voice, the receiver will, take it differently. It'll be the silences, the pauses. It'll be facial expressions when they're looking impatient or, so loudness of voices. These are some of the things I look out for. And in my professional life, that's actually quite difficult to translate or interpret because my worry is, let's say somebody's really angry. Do I amplify that message by interpreting in a really angry tone of voice? Or do I remain neutral and professional? Because whoever I'm interpreting for can already see that the person's angry or sad. So different interpreters will have a different approach to that. Mine is that my tone of voice is pretty even and leveled, and I try not to introduce extra elements.
Let's put Eva, the interpreter, and the actor off stage, and let's just focus on Eva. How do you explore unsaid in everyday dialogue?
I look at it. I analyze it. I try and understand the context. I try and look into myself and work out whether what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing, or what I'm not hearing or seeing, how do I translate that into what I understand, given that I am from a different culture and context and situation. So I'm always watchful, kind of aware, and I try to learn lessons from it. So every time I see somebody or speak to them and, I've assessed them, I think to myself, okay, what lesson am I learning from this? What can I take away to enrich my own communication, my own listening skills, my own professional practice or my own personal life? But I think, when you're dealing with people from other cultures, give them the benefit of the doubt because they come from a different context which may not be aligned with yours. Give them space to explain, give them an opportunity. That would be sort of final words from Eva.
And they're great final words to leave us on, Eva.
Deep listening.
Deep listening. Kuingisela shinene.
Kukai kikitori.
Deep listening.
I love the way that Eva has brought her passion for listening into every conversation she has each day. The way she brings that passion in her personal and professional life is quite powerful. I hope you took away the fact that although we may live in modern, multicultural and secular societies, the opportunities for misunderstanding in everyday conversations are literally everywhere. But by taking a bit of time to understand what people are actually expressing and meaning by listening more deeply, we can remove chaos, confusion and conflict. And Eva did a great job of this.
Deep listening.
Kukai kikitori.
Deep listening.
Deep listening. Lourdes Lassalle.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Whakarongo hohonu.
Deep listening. Impact beyond words.